At 0615 on April 7th, 1944, Corporal Sam Walker crouched behind a twisted wreckage, a downed P-40, sweat and gun oil stinging his eyes as he listened to the enemy closing in. 24 years old, a mechanic by trade, Walker had never fired a shot in anger before this week. Now, surrounded by Japanese troops in the dense jungle, he gripped a weapon that had been the butt of every joke in his unit, a gun he'd built himself from scavenged aircraft parts, scrap metal, and a stubborn refusal to give up. Just days earlier, his sergeant had called a death wish on a trigger. The others had laughed, betting it would jam before it ever fired. "You're not in a workshop now, Sam," one had said. "You're in a war." But Walker had seen what the jungle did to standard-issue rifles, mud-clawed bolts, rusted barrels, and ammunition that vanished faster than hope. He'd spent nights in the maintenance tent, piecing together a weapon from the wreckage, testing it in secret, and ignoring the snickers from the men who thought he was wasting his time. Now, as the sun rose and the enemy fanned out through the undergrowth, Walker's invention was all that stood between his battered squad and certain death. The Japanese soldiers advanced, confident and methodical, expecting nothing more than a few desperate shots before the Americans were overrun. No one believed a mechanic's homemade gun could change the outcome. Not the enemy, not his own men, and, if he was honest, not even Walker himself. But as he chambered the first round and took aim, something shifted. The ridicule faded, replaced by a cold clarity. He had built this weapon for a moment just like this, when there was nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Yet to truly understand how a pile of aircraft parts became a lifeline in the jungle, you have to see the brutal world these men were fighting in, and why desperation sometimes breeds the greatest acts of ingenuity. The Pacific Theater in 1944 was a world defined by extremes. Heat that wilted the strongest men, rain that turned the ground to soup, and jungles so dense they swallowed entire battalions. For Allied soldiers, every day was a battle not just against the enemy, but against the land itself. The Japanese had mastered the art of jungle warfare, using the terrain to their advantage, setting ambushes along narrow trails, and vanishing into green after every attack. Patrols could leave camp at dawn and never return, lost in the maze of vines, mud, and sudden violence. Communication lines were fragile, supply drops unreliable, and the front line shifted with every skirmish. It was all too easy for a unit to find itself isolated, cut off from reinforcements and resupply. In these moments, survival depended on what you could carry, what you could fix, and what you could invent. Standard-issue weapons, M1 Garands, Thompsons, Bars, were designed for open fields and clear lines of sight, not for the choking undergrowth and relentless humidity of the Pacific. Rifles jammed with mud, machine guns rusted overnight, and ammunition was always in short supply. The Japanese, meanwhile, were relentless and resourceful. They fortified every ridge and ravine, booby-trapped abandoned positions, and used captured Allied weapons against their former owners. Their own Arisaka rifles and Nambu machine guns were rugged, but even they struggled in the jungle's grip. The real advantage came from adaptability. Whoever could improvise, repair, and repurpose would survive. For most soldiers, improvisation meant patching a torn boot or fashioning a poncho from parachute. For Sam Walker, it meant something more radical. He saw the piles of wrecked aircraft and broken equipment, not as junk, but as a toolbox. Where others saw defeat, he saw a possibility. In a world where the rules change with every rainstorm and every ambush, Walker's willingness to build something new from the ruins would become his greatest weapon. And as the enemy closed in, it was a spirit of invention, born of necessity and desperation, that would set him apart from every other man on the line. Sam Walker was the kind of man who could fix anything. Born and raised in a small Ohio town, he grew up in his father's garage, learning to coax life from battered engines and rusted farm tools. By the time he was 16, he could strip down a tractor blindfolded and rebuild it by dinner. When the war came, Walker enlisted not for glory, but because he believed every machine on the front needed a steady hand behind it. The Army quickly recognized his knack for repairs, assigning him to the maintenance crews that kept the lifeblood of the campaign, trucks, tanks, and aircraft running in the worst conditions imaginable. But Walker's talents went beyond the standard field manual. He was a tinkerer, a problem solver who saw potential in every scrap of metal. If a part broke and the right replacement wasn't available, he'd make one. If a tool didn't exist, he'd invent it. His bunk was always cluttered with springs, bolts, and bits of wire, and his pockets jingled with the promise of solution to the next problem. Some men admired his ingenuity, grateful when a patchwork fix got them home. Others rolled their eyes, calling him the professor or Doc Frankenstein, half in jest, half in doubt. Walker felt the weight of their skepticism. In a world where conformity was safety, his constant tinkering set him apart. The officers wanted soldiers who followed orders, not mechanics who questioned every design. His squad mates joked that he'd rather talk to a carburetor than a comrade. When he started piecing together a weapon from aircraft wreckage, the laughter grew louder. "You planning to shoot down Zeros with that thing, Sam?" one man teased. "Or just scare them off with the noise?" Yet beneath the jokes, Walker carried a quiet determination. He knew the jungle didn't care about regulations or standard issue. It cared about what worked. Every time he was doubted, every time someone dismissed his ideas, it only fueled his resolve. He wasn't building the gun for recognition or pride. He was building it because he believed, deep down, that when the chips were down, the man who could adapt would be the one left standing. And as the days grew darker and the enemy drew closer, that belief would be put to the ultimate test. The trouble began with a sudden, violent ambush. Walker's unit had been moving along a narrow jungle trail, the kind where the canopy blotted out the sun, and every step felt like walking into a trap. The Japanese struck with ruthless precision. Machine gun bursts from hidden bunkers, mortars erupting in the undergrowth, and snipers picking off anyone who moved. In the chaos, the line of communication snapped. Radios were destroyed, runners never returned. And within an hour, Walker's squad was cut off from the rest of the battalion. They fell back to a patch of high ground near the wreckage of a P-40, the only cover in a sea of tangled vines and mud. Supplies were low. The last resupply drop had missed its mark, and what little ammunition they had was quickly dwindling. Standard-issue rifles jammed with mud, and the squad's only machine gun had been lost in the retreat. The men were exhausted, hungry, and running on fear. Every night, the Japanese probed their perimeter, testing for weakness, whispering in the darkness to unsettle the Americans. By day, snipers kept them pinned, and every attempt to break out was met with a hail of bullets. Standard doctrine offered little hope. The manuals were clear. If cut off, dig in, conserve ammunition, and wait for relief. But in the Pacific, relief was never guaranteed. The jungle swallowed entire companies, and rescue missions often ended in disaster. The Japanese were masters of siege tactics, content to wait as hunger and fear did their work. The men knew the stories, units that vanished without a trace, their last stand marked only by a few spent shells and a broken radio. Walker's squad was down to a handful of grenades, a few working rifles, and whatever courage they could muster. The enemy was closing in, confident and methodical, tightening the noose with each passing hour. The Americans' only advantage was the wreckage around them, twisted metal, broken engines, and the scattered remains of what had once been a fighter plane. To most, it was just junk, a reminder of how far they'd fallen. But to Walker, it was a challenge. He knew the odds. No one expected them to survive. The men whispered about making a run for it. But the jungle was thick with enemy patrols. Surrender was unthinkable. The stories of captured soldiers were enough to keep even the bravest awake at night. Every calculation pointed to the same grim conclusion. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and out of time. Yet as Walker surveyed the wreckage, his mind began to race. He saw not just broken parts, but possibilities. A barrel here, a spring there, a trigger assembly that could be coaxed back to life. Where others saw the end, he saw a sliver of hope. But building a weapon from scraps was more than a gamble. It was an act of defiance against the very rules that said survival was impossible. And as the enemy tightened their grip, Walker's determination hardened. If the jungle wanted to swallow them, it would have to choke on a mechanic's last, desperate invention. Walker wasted no time. As soon as the perimeter was set and the first uneasy night passed, he crawled to the wrecked P-40, heart pounding with a mix of fear and purpose. The others watched him with a blend of curiosity and disbelief. "You really think you're going to build us a miracle out here?" one man muttered, shaking his head. Another, more bitter, just grumbled, "We need bullets, not a science project." But Walker ignored them. He had learned long ago that doubt was just another problem to solve. He started by stripping the aircraft for anything remotely useful. The .50 caliber machine gun was too damaged to fire, but the barrel was intact. He salvaged springs from the landing gear, a length of control cable for a makeshift trigger, and scavenged a battered ammo box. Piece by piece, he laid out his findings in the mud, his hands moving with the practiced confidence of a man who had rebuilt engines in the dark. But this was no workshop, and every step was a battle against the elements. Rain turned the ground to muck, and the ever-present threat of snipers forced him to work low and fast. The first attempt was a disaster. The firing pin, fashioned from a section of tail strut, snapped on the first test. The makeshift trigger jammed, refusing to budge. When he finally managed to load a round and pull the cable, the weapon misfired, sending a puff of smoke and a shower of sparks, but nothing more. The squad, already on edge, was quick to voice their frustration. "Told you it was a waste of time," someone hissed. "We're dead, man, and he's playing with junk." Walker felt the sting of their words, but desperation kept him going. He worked through the night, hands raw and eyes burning from lack of sleep. He tried a new firing pin, reinforced the trigger, and scavenged a spring from a broken radio for extra tension. Each failure taught him something: what wouldn't work, what might, and how little time he had left. The enemy was getting bolder, their patrols pressing closer, their voices sometimes audible in the darkness. Every misfire, every jam, was another minute lost, another chance for the Japanese to close in. By the third day, the tension in the camp was palpable. Supplies were almost gone, and the men's patience was wearing thin. Even Walker began to doubt. His hands shook as he tightened the bolt, wondering if he was chasing a fantasy. But as he looked at the faces of his squad, hollow-eyed, desperate, clinging to any hope, he knew he couldn't stop. The jungle was closing in, and if his invention failed, there would be no second chances. Then, just before dawn, a faint click echoed through the clearing. Walker had rebuilt the firing mechanism yet again, this time using a section of landing gear strut, and a spring wound tighter than he thought possible. He loaded a single round, braced the weapon against a rock, and pulled the cable. The gun barked, a sharp, unmistakable report that cut through the jungle silence. The squad jerked awake, eyes wide. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, hope flickered in the gloom. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and as the sun rose, Walker knew the real test was still to come. Dawn crept over the jungle, painting the battered clearing in pale gold. Walker sat hunched over his creation, hands caked with grease and mud, eyes red from another sleepless night. The squad was silent, each man lost in his own thoughts, the weight of hunger and fear pressing down like the humid air. No one expected much anymore. The gun was still a joke to most, a desperate man's distraction from the inevitable. "It'll blow up in your face, Sam," one of the older privates muttered, not unkindly. "Might as well sharpen a stick." Even Walker, for a moment, wondered if he was clinging to hope just to keep his mind off the closing noose. But as the sun broke through the canopy, something changed. The enemy was moving again, their voices drifting closer, the snap of twigs and the rustle of leaves betraying their approach. The squad tensed, clutching their last grenades and battered rifles. Walker checked the gun one last time, feeling the tension in the new spring, the smooth slide of the makeshift bolt. He loaded a round, braced the weapon, and waited. The first Japanese soldier appeared at the edge of the clearing, rifle raised, eyes scanning for movement. Walker exhaled, squeezed the trigger cable, and prayed. The gun fired, a sharp, clean report, the recoil jarring but manageable. The enemy's soldier dropped, vanishing into the undergrowth. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then another enemy appeared, and Walker fired again. The gun barked, and the second man fell. The squad stared in disbelief. The weapon that was supposed to be a death trap was working reliably, powerfully, and with a range that matched anything the enemy carried. Suddenly, the dynamic shifted. The Japanese, expecting an easy kill, hesitated. They ducked for cover, uncertain where the new threat was coming from. Walker's squad, emboldened, began to call out targets, trusting his aim. The gun's improvised design, lighter than a standard machine gun, easier to maneuver in the thick brush, gave Walker an edge no one had anticipated. He could fire, shift position, and reload faster than the enemy expected. The sound of the homemade gun echoed through the trees, a defiant answer to the enemy's confidence. Everyone had said it was impossible. The manuals didn't cover building weapons from scrap. The officers back at base would have called it reckless, even dangerous. But in the jungle, where the rules were written by survival, Walker's invention was rewriting the odds. The squad skepticism melted into awe. Men who had mocked him now scrambled to help, feeding him ammunition, watching his back, and covering his flanks. The gun became more than a tool. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that ingenuity could still tip the scales, even when everything else was lost. As the day wore on, the enemy's attacks grew less confident. Each time they probed the perimeter, Walker's gun answered, forcing them back. The squad began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could hold out. Walker, exhausted but resolute, kept working, cleaning, adjusting, and firing, determined not to let his creation fail. If you think the story ends here, you're mistaken. The real test was still ahead, and the legend of the aircraft gun was about to be forged in fire. The jungle was a living, breathing thing, thick with the scent of wet earth, the buzz of insects, and the ever-present tension of unseen eyes. For Walker and his squad, the world had shrunk to a muddy patch of ground ringed by wreckage and desperation. The enemy was everywhere, their movements a constant whisper in the undergrowth, their presence felt in every snapped twig and every shadow that lingered too long. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that made every breath feel like a countdown. The first major assault came just after midday. The Japanese, frustrated by the stubborn resistance, launched a coordinated attack from 3 sides. Walker's squad braced themselves, hearts pounding, knuckles white around rifle stocks and grenade pins. Walker crouched behind a twisted engine block, his homemade gun balanced on a makeshift bipod fashioned from landing gear struts. He could see the enemy moving, shapes darting between trees, flashes of uniforms, the glint of bayonets in the dappled light. He waited, patient as a mechanic at a stubborn bolt, letting the enemy close. When the first wave broke cover, he squeezed the trigger cable. The gun roared, spitting fire and lead, the recoil of familiar jolt through his arms. The first line of attackers faltered, men dropping in the tangled brush. The squad opened up, emboldened by the sudden, devastating firepower. For the first time, the enemy hesitated, their advance stalling under the unexpected barrage. But the Japanese regrouped quickly. A second wave pressed in, using smoke grenades and covering fire to mask their approach. Walker adjusted his aim, firing in short, controlled bursts to conserve the precious handful of rounds he had managed to salvage. The gun's improvised design allowed him to pivot quickly, tracking targets as they tried to flank the position. Each shot was a gamble, each reload a race against time. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he never lost focus. The battle raged for hours, the line between day and night blurring into chaos. Walker's hands were raw, his shoulders aching from the constant recoil. The gun jammed twice, once when a spent casing lodged in the chamber, once when a spring slipped loose. Both times, Walker worked with frantic precision, fingers moving by instinct, clearing the malfunction and getting the weapon back in action before the enemy could exploit the lull. His squad covered him, firing blindly into the jungle, their trust in him now absolute. The casualties mounted. By the end of the second assault, the ground in front of their position was littered with enemy uniforms. The squad, once resigned to defeat, now fought with ferocity born of hope. They called out targets, relayed ammunition, and watched Walker with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The man they had once mocked was now their anchor, his invention the difference between life and death. As dusk fell, the Japanese launched one final, desperate charge. They came in waves, shouting battle cries, determined to overrun the battered Americans before nightfall. Walker's gun blazed, the muzzle flashing in the gloom, each shot a defiant answer to the enemy's fury. The squad fought back to back, grenades and bayonets flashing in the fading light. The noise was deafening, gunfire, screams, the crash of bodies in the brush. In the chaos, Walker lost track of how many times he fired, how many times he reloaded, how many times he thought it was over. But each time the enemy surged, the gun answered, cutting them down, forcing them back. The final tally would not be known until morning, but the ground was silent. The enemy gone, the squad still standing. When the sun rose, the full scope of what had happened became clear. 20 enemy soldiers lay dead in the tangled brush, their advance broken by a weapon no one had believed in. The squad gathered around Walker, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion, their eyes shining with something like reverence. The ridicule was gone, replaced by respect and a quiet sense of wonder. The homemade gun, battered and blackened, was passed from hand to hand, its legend already growing. Walker sat in the mud, the gun across his knees, too tired to speak. He looked at his squad, men who had doubted, men who had survived, and felt the weight of what they had accomplished. The jungle was still dangerous, the war far from over. But for one night, ingenuity and courage had turned the tide. And as the first rays of sunlight pierced the canopy, the legend of the aircraft gun was no longer a joke, but a story that would be told long after the last shot was fired. When the last echoes of gunfire faded and the jungle settled into uneasy silence, the transformation within Walker's squad was unmistakable. Men who had once rolled their eyes at his tinkering now looked at him with a new respect, their skepticism replaced by gratitude and awe. The battered homemade gun, blackened by smoke and streaked with mud, was no longer a curiosity or a punchline. It was a symbol of survival, a testament to what could be achieved when necessity met ingenuity. Word of the night's battle spread quickly. When a relief patrol finally broke the following afternoon, they found Walker's squad battered but alive, holding a position that should have been overrun a dozen times. The relief commander, expecting to find only casualties and chaos, instead found a group of exhausted men clustered around a weapon that defied every regulation and expectation. The story spilled out in fragments, how Walker had built the gun from the wreckage, how it had turned the tide, how the enemy had been driven back again and again by a mechanic's invention. The impact rippled beyond the squad. Other units, hearing the tale, sent their own mechanics to see the gun, to ask Walker how he'd done it. Officers who had once dismissed him as a dreamer now listened carefully as he explained the modifications, the failures, and the final breakthrough. Some even took notes, hoping to replicate his success in other desperate corners of the front. The gun itself became a minor legend, passed from hand to hand. Its scars indent a record of the night it had saved them all. For Walker, the respect was bittersweet. He had never set out to be a hero or to prove anyone wrong. He had built the gun because there was no other choice, because the jungle demanded solutions that manuals couldn't provide. Yet as he watched his squad clean their weapons and prepare for the next patrol, he felt a quiet pride. The laughter and doubt were gone, replaced by a sense of belonging he had never quite felt before. The homemade gun, too battered for further use, was eventually sent back to headquarters as a curiosity, a piece of battlefield ingenuity to be studied and, perhaps, imitated. But its true legacy lived on in the men who had survived, in the story that spread through the ranks, and in the knowledge that sometimes the difference between failure and legend is simply the courage to try when everyone else has given up. Sam Walker's story is more than a tale of survival. It's a testament to the power of thinking differently when everything is on the line. In a world where following orders and sticking to the manual was often the safest path, Walker dared to trust his instincts and his skills, even when it meant standing alone. His willingness to improvise, to see possibility in a pile of wreckage, and keep working through failure became the difference between defeat and survival for his squad. Innovation in war is rarely celebrated in the moment. It's born out of desperation, shaped by necessity, and often met with skepticism or outright resistance. Yet history is filled with moments where a single act of ingenuity changed the course of battle or even a war. Walker's homemade gun was never just about metal and mechanics. It was about the courage to try, the refusal to accept defeat, and the belief that solutions can come from the most unlikely places. For every soldier, engineer, or dreamer who's ever been told that's impossible, Walker's legacy is a beacon. It reminds us that progress is made by those who question, who tinker, who refuse to give up when the odds are stacked against them. His story deserves to be remembered not just for the lives it saved, but for the spirit it represents, a spirit of resilience, creativity, and hope in the darkest of times. As long as there are challenges to face and problems to solve, the lesson the aircraft gun endures. Sometimes, the greatest victories come from those who dare to build their own way forward, even when no one else believes it can be done. If this story inspired you, please like the video and subscribe for more incredible true accounts of courage and ingenuity from World War II. Share your thoughts or family stories in the comments. Your voice helps keep these memories alive for future generations. Don't let these forgotten heroes fade into history. Every story matters, and together we can make sure they're never lost. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next remarkable tale of battlefield innovation. There are more hidden stories waiting to be discovered, and you won't want to miss what comes next.